Honey Glazed Hamlet is the delightful second segment of the 10th episode of the first season of the Book of Pooh. Technically, I've already reviewed the first segment, Mr. Narrator, because it's a repeat of an episode that appeared earlier. Not entirely sure why they decided to double it up, but Honey Glazed Hamlet is so wonderful that it's absolutely worth just one episode in its own, and I wish it was a double-parter. I don't think it needed to be, but personally I would have enjoyed it. This is all about Shakespeare, and to quote Pooh Bear, who is this William fellow and why is he shaking his spear? Honestly, it made me laugh, probably more than it should have done. Pooh Bear and Piglet are at Owl's house and they come across a collection of Shakespeare's plays and poems, and they find out that Owl feels nostalgic for his time at Oxford when he would perform Shakespeare, and to quote the episode, nostalgia sounds like a terrible disease. But they learn that actually nostalgia is a beautiful thing about reflecting on times past, and they decide to make Owl feel better by putting on a Shakespeare based play, and we have the characters dressed in wonderful costumes. Pooh Bear is taking on the role of Shakespeare, Tigger is very appropriately the jester with a wonderful costume design, and the Hundred Acre Players put on this performance inspired by Shakespeare with a song about Shakespeare, and it's absolutely delightful. There are so many Shakespeare quotes in this and references to Shakespeare plays. I do think maybe having so many Shakespeare quotes wasn't a good idea. For me, as a 31-year-old Shakespeare fan, absolutely. But for a young kind of 4 or 5-year-old watching this, they're not really going to understand what's being said and understand what's going on. And I feel like a few quotes would have been a good idea, but there are quite a lot of them. And that's going to be very confusing for a young child, particularly if the child doesn't understand why they don't understand. Because if they watch every episode of Pooh Bear and they understand everything, then all of a sudden there's this episode where they're just confused by these speeches. That's in itself is going to be kind of baffling. So, on the one hand, I personally love the amount of Shakespeare quotes. On the other, I feel like it wasn't the best decision for the target audience. So, I'm kind of on the fence with how I feel about it. However, if you're a grown up Shakespeare fan, I think you'll find this really charming, and the costumes are delightful. The various Shakespeare references are, for me, brilliant, but I still think maybe slightly confusing for younger children. But at the same time, I imagine this will be a lot of young children's introduction to Shakespeare. I can't remember when I first found out about Shakespeare. I've got no idea. But I don't believe I would have known who Shakespeare was when I was, 4, 5, 6, 7 years old. And I think this is a pretty good way to get children learning about Shakespeare quite early. There are a lot of adaptations of Shakespeare's works for young children. Granted, a lot of Shakespeare's works are not necessarily child friendly, but there are still adaptations out there for children, which I think is a pretty good thing. So personally, I really enjoyed it. If you're a fan of Winnie the Pooh and Shakespeare, I think you'll find the combination to be absolutely delightful. Maybe a little bit too much for very young children, but if it introduces them to Shakespeare, I'm not going to complain. And very well written, great puppetry work, gorgeous costumes, generally an absolutely delightful episode.